If you grew up like me in the 70s and 80s of the last century, you learned that the communists were the enemy. I was drafted and had to learn the silhouettes of Soviet tanks and aircrafts to defend Queen and country. Great was the general relief when the Berlin Wall fell on the 9th of November in 1989, and at last the fear of nuclear destruction was over. Few knew at that time that Stanislav Petrov, a lieutenant colonel of the Soviet Air Defense Forces, saved the world in 1983 from nuclear destruction when the early warning system of the Soviets registered the launch of 5 nuclear missiles from US soil, and Petrov, against orders, deemed it correctly a false alarm. Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev became a Western hero and met with US President George Bush Sr. in Malta and declared the end of the Cold War on the 3rd of December in 1989. On the 12th of September 1990, in Moscow, a treaty was signed between Russia, USA, United Kingdom, France and the two Germanys for the reunification of Germany, which followed on the 3rd of October 1990. Although it was not signed in this treaty, the Russians understood that NATO would not expand into the former Warsaw Pact. When Poland, Czech Republic and Hungary applied for NATO membership in 1996, former Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev held a speech in the US Congress in 1997 and explained how this was a bad idea.
It also means that the congressmen are... I believe it's a mistake. It's a bad mistake.
И меня не убедят заявления, декларации самого такого респектабельного характера относительно того, что России нечего беспокоить.
And I'm not persuaded by the assurances that we hear that Russia has nothing to worry about. That was abruptly suspended or terminated in 1990.
Нельзя унижать народ, нацию, и нельзя рассчитывать, что это так пройдет все.
You may not humiliate a nation, a people, and think that it'll have no consequences.
NATO, nonetheless, continued with expanding NATO in 1999 with Poland, Czech Republic and Hungary. And in 2004 and 2009, even further expansion followed in the east of Europe. Georgia applied for NATO membership in 1994 and the Ukraine in 2008. Putin already strongly opposed against this and could stop NATO expansion of Georgia and Ukraine.
As the NATO summit wrapped up in Romania, leaders welcomed Russian President Vladimir Putin to speak. He's been clear about his opposition to NATO membership for Ukraine and Georgia. The former Soviet republics had hoped for a green light from the alliance to start the process toward membership. Instead, NATO put the offer on hold. Secretary General Jaap de Hoop Scheffer says the two countries will eventually be a part of NATO.
But I stand to be corrected if the sentence we agreed today that these countries in the text, read Ukraine and Georgia, will become members of NATO, leaves a shimmer of a doubt. Not in my opinion.
The Northern Alliance also okayed missile defense plans for Europe that call for systems to be built in Poland and the Czech Republic. That's another alliance move that Putin strongly opposes. Despite being at odds with NATO over some of its plans, Russia has agreed to a transit deal that allows NATO to ship non-lethal freight across Russian territory to military forces in Afghanistan. President Bush.
So why is Russia so afraid for these expansions? As you can see in the map, Russia has a difficult geography, with a big part of its country in the Arctic Circle and in the far east and southeast, mountains and deserts. Food production is only possible in a small area, and the biggest part of the population lives there. The problem is that this is part of the northern European plain, where Russia had a long list of invasions. Among these invaders are the Mongol hordes, the Swedes, the French, and last but maybe not least, the Germans. Russia has also a difficult demography. Besides the fact that females exceed the male population big time after the age of 60 due to high vodka consumption, Russian births took a big dip in 1991 with the fall of the Soviet Union. And the expectations are that the demographics will go further down from 145 to about 122 million people in 2050. Russia has an enormous border to defend, and as the population will go down, it is expected that it can't maintain its current military force of almost 1 million soldiers. As said, the Russians have been invaded many times throughout history, and in order to defend smaller borders, it can block some strategic gaps which fall in place with natural obstructions like mountains and seas. Once Russian forces are in those gaps, the Russian motherland is better protected against possible invasions. Why NATO wanted to expand east? This is up for debate. Some argue that those former Warsaw countries wanted to feel protected against a future return of Russian influence, and others argue that NATO needed a reason to exist. Clear reasons were never given, but NATO clearly pushed forward east, maybe hoping that Russia would join in. Putin, who came to power in 1999, became a welcome guest to Western leaders, started to react stronger against expansion of NATO throughout the years, and warned about the possible consequences, especially with NATO installing the missile shield in Poland and Romania. Russia, like the USA with the Cuban Missile Crisis, didn't sit on his hands while they saw what is happening and had a special military operation in Georgia in 2008, and after the Ukraine Maidan Revolt of 2013, which led to the fall of the pro-Russian regime, occupied the Crimea in 2014, which led to economic sanctions against Russia. From the Russian point of view, you can see why they think they have to act as NATO expanded for years eastwards and installing a missile shield. A shield which can be easily transformed into an attacking nuclear warhead missile force on its doorstep. Furthermore, the USA withdrew unilateral without clear reasons from the Anti-Ballistic Missiles Treaty in 2001 during the Bush Sr. administration. The Trump administration withdrew from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Treaty in 2018. Putin now halted the last major remaining nuclear arms control treaty with the US, the so-called New START Treaty, which expires in 2026. How does Russia respond? Russia projects its defense into those earlier named gaps, where also ethnic Russians live, the Baltic countries, Moldavia, Belarus and Ukraine. Protecting a Russian-speaking population is a good excuse for explaining to your own people why you invade another country, just like Hitler did in 1938 with the Germans living in Sudetenland, and therefore occupied the Czech Republic. Putin's regime of more than 20 years has shifted from a young struggling democracy, very welcomed by the West, to a dictatorship. Critics and opponents are arrested, or worse, killed by poison. Even friendly oligarchs have unexplainable deadly accidents. Russia expanded their oil and gas deals with Europe via a variety of pipelines, and especially Germany became a big customer.
I found it to be very straightforward and trustworthy. I was able to get a sense of his soul. I wouldn't have invited him to my ranch if I didn't trust him.
The part that Russia has played in the international community since the 11th of September has been remarkable. I mean, we have cooperation today that would have been really unthinkable just a short time ago.
Der sehr freundschaftlichen Zusammenarbeit zwischen Russland und Deutschland, die vermutlich nie so gut war, wie sie jetzt ist Vertrauen.
I am confident that this new level of cooperation between NATO's members and Russia will now change the world and for the better.
Поэтому предлагаю с этого момента штаб-квартиру НАТО переименовать в Дом Советов. Думаю, что это неплохое предложение.
I will declare that to be a joke.
Do I trust him? Yeah, I trust him.
Russian heavy guns were firing at Georgian positions inside Georgia. Buildings are burning from the last airstrike, and people are warning that the Russian Air Force may soon be back.
I brought with me today a big delegation of British business, all with an interest in expanding their trade with Russia.
We seek a significant and sensible approach to economic development across our continent, and to that end will now be closely interconnected for decades to come.
J'ai trouvé un homme
très au fait de ces dossiers, très calme, très intelligent.
I'm aware of the extraordinary work that you've done on behalf of the Russian people.
Breaking news from Ukraine. Overnight, armed men seized control of 2 government buildings as Putin announces he's sending troops.
Many of Putin's critics have mysteriously become ill or died.
Apparent vicious political assassination of one of President Vladimir Putin's most outspoken critics.
A new report about Russian interference in the presidential election. Next, a look at how strong the evidence is that points to the Putin government.
Former Russian spy is in a critical condition in hospital in
Investigators suspect the Kremlin could be behind the incident in Salisbury on Sunday.
He says great things about me. I'm going to say great things about him. He's been a leader far more than our president has been a leader.
Wouldn't it be great if we actually got along with Russia? Am I wrong in saying that? Wouldn't it be great? I believe.
2 years of COVID stopped the world as we knew it. But at the end of 2021, Russia and Belarus started to bring military forces to the Ukraine border. And in the beginning of February 2022, the US warned for an invasion, and President Biden informed the world that the US will make sure that the gas pipeline Nord Stream 2, which provides cheap gas to Germany, will not be open for business if Russia invades the Ukraine.
Well, I'll take a couple questions each. Reuters, Andrea, you got the first question.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Chancellor Scholz. Mr. President, I have wanted to ask you about this Nord Stream project that you've long opposed. You didn't mention it just now by name, nor did Chancellor Scholz. Did you receive assurances from Chancellor Scholz today that Germany will in fact pull the plug on this project if Russia invades Ukraine? And did you discuss what the definition of invasion could be? And then Chancellor Scholz, wenn ich Sie fragen darf,
if I may ask you, Chancellor Scholz, you said there was some strategic ambiguity that was needed in terms of sanctions. I just wanted to know whether the sanctions you are envisaging and the EU is working on, and the US as well, are already finished, finalized, or is there still work ongoing? And
dass Sie das nicht sagen wollen, was genau da drin ist.
You're not really saying what the details are. Is that just an excuse for Germany maybe to not support the SWIFT measures?
Let me answer the first question first. If Russia invades, that means tanks or troops crossing the border of Ukraine again. Then there will be no longer a Nord Stream 2. We will bring an end to it.
How will you do that exactly, since the project and control of the project is within Germany's control?
We will. I promise you, we'll be able to do it.
September 2022, Nord Stream 2 pipeline is sabotaged by an unknown country. As Germany and Russia had nothing to gain, the suspicion of it being the US is probably right. The war is now at a stalemate where no one is sure who will win. NATO, but especially the US, is providing the Ukraine with more and better weapons and intelligence. And the question pops up, why the US is doing this? Cost of it already $78 billion for the Biden administration. What can the US possibly gain by destroying Nord Stream 2 and supporting the Ukrainians? Stop an aggressor from invading another country? The US wouldn't hesitate to invade Iraq based on false accusations, or we doesn't act while Saudi Arabia bombs Houthi civil population in Yemen, nor did it act in 2011 when Kenya invaded Somalia. Russia is not seen as the enemy, as its GDP and military power is not big enough to form a threat to the US. GDP is less than 1/10 that of the US. The population is in decline, and the military is not up to the task, as we can see in the Ukraine. So who is the enemy? In the next video, you can listen to Undersecretary of State Victoria Nuland from the Democratic Party confirming the US determination on Nord Stream 2 in January of 2023. During a Foreign Relations Committee of the US Senate with former president candidate and now Republican Senator Ted Cruz explaining who is the real enemy.
Ms. Newland, as you know, in January of last year, the Senate voted on my legislation to impose sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And it did so before Russia had invaded Ukraine. When the Senate voted on those sanctions, President Zelensky publicly urged, even begged, the United States Senate to pass those sanctions. And President Zelensky said, passing those sanctions then were the last chance to prevent Russia from invading Ukraine, the last chance to prevent Russian tanks rolling into Ukraine. Was President Zelensky wrong?
Senator Cruz, like you, I am, and I think the administration is very gratified to know that Nord Stream 2 is now, as you like to say, a hunk of metal at the bottom of the sea.
Okay, well, let's talk about how the war is going. And I know that you and I both agree that it is important for Russia to suffer a crushing defeat. Putin is a KGB thug, and he's committed to undermining our interests and our enemies across the globe, including in particular China.
So China is the real enemy, as Ted Cruz names it. And that makes more sense. China is, with its almost 18 trillion US dollar GDP, now the second largest economy in the world. It has a huge population and a worldwide projection with its One Belt, One Road initiative. Also, China knows it is in competition with the US and expanded its military power. Furthermore, the Chinese have been working with Russia and other countries to develop alternatives to the role for the US dollar as the main world currency, undermining the petrodollar, setting up alternatives to the America-controlled SWIFT banking system, and the US knows this is a real threat. China now has developed missiles with enough range to take out the US fleet in a Pearl Harbor-like event, and therefore creating in theory the possibility to invade Taiwan. China sees Taiwan part of its territory and wants it back within a decade. China could so break through the first and second island rings, which contains China from shipping freely with the rest of the world. Taiwan semiconductor company TSMC is about 3 to 5 years ahead of American company Intel, and together with Dutch company ASML, responsible for the technological advance the US has over China, and therefore cannot fall in the hand of the Chinese. The US now have taken countermeasures and have made a deal with Australia, making sure Australia will have nuclear submarines, and the US a B-52 nuclear bomber base in the north of Australia, where it will be out of range of Chinese missiles, but in range to attack China. Also, the US has stationed 3 battle fleets permanently in the area. The US have made sure that the Chinese can't get their hands on the most modern semiconductor technology via sanctions. And the US knows that by defeating Putin, the US isolates China as it needs the raw materials and oil from Russia in order to keep the lights on and maintain the upper hand in this chess game between those two giants.